Beautiful. Okay, great, thanks. Well, I'm still Josh, but I have something different to talk about now. Okay, so we often draw a distinction between direct use of a computer, meaning editing documents, sending emails, watching YouTube, and programming a computer, making it do new things. But this distinction begins to get pretty blurry with end-user programming. Like, what about making a spreadsheet, or styling a homepage with CSS, or making a reusable component in Figma, or doing some lightweight file management at the shell? Which of these counts as programming? Well, I don't know, but that's what this talk is about, these blurry boundaries between programming and direct use. So I hope to convince you that it's not really clear what is and isn't programming. And at the start, this may seem like kind of philosophical faffery, but I hope by the end you'll agree with me that this is really a weird, rich space worth exploring. So we're going to approach programming in three ways, in terms of its ends, in terms of its means, and as a lens. First, programming as ends. How would you define programming? I think this is really the classic paradigm of programming. Textual code in a general purpose Turing-complete language. Many people in the world might define programming to be basically things that look like this. But I imagine that many of us here at Plateau take a more expansive view than this. We're often interested in programming with pictures rather than just with words. Or programming by recording actions that are taken on concrete data. Or using targeted DSLs rather than general purpose languages. So one argument that all of these should count as programming is that there are often alternative ways of constructing the same things. For example, you can code a dynamic data visualization in JavaScript, or you can make it by demonstration, or you can make it with a DSL. So maybe we should define programming in terms of the artifacts that it produces, that is to say, its ends. And that's what Coe et al. Did in their survey of end-user programming. To keep a broad view, they focused on what programs do rather than how they're built, defining a program to be a collection of specifications that may take variable inputs. So maybe that's the key. Maybe programming is about making things that take inputs, things that can execute on future values. So let's give these a name. We'll call them dynamic artifacts. Dynamic artifacts, naturally, are in contrast to static artifacts, like a PDF, or a video, or an audio file. Static artifacts have some output that we can see or hear, but this output doesn't change with changing input. Dynamic artifacts can change. For instance, a dynamic artifact can change through direct interaction with a user, like a video game. Or a dynamic artifact can respond to some other stream of data, like how Natalie Jeremenjenko's dangling string would shape to represent Ethernet traffic. Okay, so we have static artifacts and dynamic artifacts, and programming means making the dynamic ones. Clear, right? No, I don't think it's so clear. So let's go back to Coe et al. They say that a VCR program, which tells a VCR to record a particular show at a particular time, should count as a program, in our terms, a dynamic artifact. That's kind of surprising, but there is logic to it. After all, the behavior of a VCR program depends on an input, time. So it is a dynamic artifact. Well, but don't videos depend on time? Don't audio files depend on time? I suppose if you think of a video as a machine that turns different times into different pictures, it does take an input. But it does this so predictably that we typically think of the video as the bundle of its frames taken together, in which case it feels more like a static artifact. So there's an ambiguity here about what qualifies as an input and therefore what qualifies as a dynamic artifact. And as a reminder of the stakes here, if making a VCR program is programming, then making a video is programming, and that means dragging clips around in a timeline in a video editor is programming. And this seems like a stretch. Views made of it seems like a stretch. So this ambiguity about when something counts as an input doesn't just apply to the input of time. Let's talk about the input of interaction. Quiz. Is a plain HTML page dynamic? Well, I mean, it's interactive, right? Because you can scroll it. Okay, but scrolling is really predictable. It's sort of built into how we interact with HTML. It's practically like zooming in on a picture and panning around. And if pictures aren't static, then what is? So it seems like some interactions shouldn't count as inputs, or at least not as interesting programmed inputs. So maybe the answer is that these artifacts lie on a spectrum. I guess you see I like spectrums. So scrolling is boring and mechanical, but what if we add CSS to a page that makes certain elements sticky on scroll? Or what about if we add CSS that makes the page rearrange its layout on different screen sizes? These feel more dynamic to me. The person who wrote this CSS is deliberately authoring dynamic behaviors. If you keep making those more and more bespoke and unpredictable, eventually you get to Tetris. And as we move more dynamic, things do feel more like programming. So there is something to this association between programming and authoring dynamic artifacts, but it's a complicated association. Okay, so we've had some trouble defining programming entirely in terms of the artifacts that it creates. So let's talk about an alternative. Programming as a certain set of mechanisms, a certain set of ways of doing things, a means. But when we do this, we need to be careful. Like, what if we end up just saying, oh yeah, means, like textual code? We don't want that. As a defense against this narrow-mindedness, we're going to approach this in a roundabout way. We're going to ask, where in direct use computing do we see hints of programmatic means applied towards direct use ends? Or in other words, when does direct use feel like programming? And I'm going to show you 3 ways to finish that sentence. First up, programming often takes the form of tool building. Maybe there are places in direct use systems where people construct tools as part of their process, dynamic artifacts as a means rather than an end. And these aren't hard to find. In fact, there's one right here. Word processors, like Google Docs, usually provide a system of labeled styles, which can be applied to text, setting attributes like font and size. When a user makes a new style, they're actually doing something pretty abstract. Making the style may not change their visible document at all, but it sets up a tool for them to use later, like when a programmer defines a function. A style, in a small way, is a dynamic artifact. It's one instance of what you might call template or reusable component systems. And these can get pretty sophisticated in direct use software. For instance, the vector graphics editor Figma has a component system where a main component can be duplicated to form instances, and components can have variants and parameters and all sorts of fancy stuff like that. So I would say that direct use feels like programming when you can define tools, which often take the form of reusable components. That's feeling number 1. But thinking of these as tools actually leaves out something important. A simple word processor might have a style system where you define a style as a brush. You apply it to text as a one-time action. That would be tool making. That would feel like programming in that way, but modern systems go well beyond that. In many of these modern systems, applying a style to text or cloning a component actually creates a persistent link between objects. Changing a style in Google Docs changes all the places where the style is used automatically. Changes to a component in Figma automatically propagate to all of its instances. So these systems take actions that would ordinarily be one-off imperative commands, like applying a style, and instead persist them as part of documents. We see something similar in Photoshop's adjustment layers. Traditionally, you apply filters with a button press, destructively. Adjustment layers let you instead put filters onto the layer stack, where they operate on everything below. When you represent a process persistently like this, you can change the inputs to the process and see how the output changes without having to manually rerun it. And this should ring some bells. Programs are persistent representations of processes. We call working with these persistent representations programming. So I believe that using adjustment layers in Photoshop is, in a small way, programming. Limited on time, so I'm going to skip some things. Instrumental interaction, check it out. But direct use feels like programming when processes are persistently represented and editable. To introduce our last feeling of programming, we're going to go to a great paper by Freilich on direct manipulation. He lists out 7 tasks he says are difficult to do by direct manipulation, reasons to prefer linguistic control. And he includes performing repetitive action. And this is a great point. Conventional programming systems are great at performing repetitive actions. If you can do it once, you can stick it into a for loop. And that feels a lot characteristically like programming. You're abstracting an action across a collection. And you can't do this in most direct use systems. Even when you have something like find and replace that allows one particular repetitive action, it's really limited. There's so many things you can do with a single text selection that you can't do with find and replace. But you know what you can use to do them is multiple cursors. I think Miller and Myers came up with this one. It's fantastic. I'm sorry if this video isn't the best at showing it, but hopefully most of you have experienced how great it feels to swiftly rearrange text with your little flock of cursors. Your actions are being amplified in a way that really feels like programming. Freilich suggests a different solution, macros. And I'm really glad that we have multi-cursor editing now, because I think it's really different from macros. Multi-cursor editing, like adjustment layers, is a way to get programmatic power while fitting into direct manipulation patterns of an existing direct use environment. Compared to macros, it's less abstract, less linguistic, more live, more integrated. And this is what I'm most excited about, not shoehorning established programming patterns into direct use systems, but building on successful direct use patterns in these ingenious ways. So that's our last feeling, acting on many objects at once. I'll go like a minute or two over, I'm sorry. Finally, programming as a lens. So maybe the thing that makes something programming isn't ends or means, but it's that we see it as programming. And when I say we here, I'm talking about the academic PL community. We have these amazing tools, and it can be really generative to take these tools and ideas and try them out in unconventional settings. Like, what if we think of Photoshop as a Photoshop file as a program? Then we would think of the layer stack as some kind of syntax, and Photoshop as an interpreter running a semantics on that. And that raises some really interesting questions. I put some here. I bet you could come up with even better ones. And I think this is great. The idea of applying the powerful disciplinary lens of PL to computing at large is a large part of why this workshop exists in the first place. But I also think we need to watch out, because the discipline of PL does not examine programming in a value-neutral way. Rather, it carries path-dependent assumptions and ways of approaching problems. What assumptions do we make about what PL plus HCI means? If you're brought up in the culture of PL, you might jump to things like, oh, where might type systems be useful here? Or what aspects of this could use mathematical formalization? But I hope I've shown that bringing programmatic power to the broader world might mean some things that are a lot weirder than that. So that's what I got. Thanks.
Okay, questions for Josh?
Yes, questions or thoughts or, feelings. I talk a lot about feelings in here, so I'd be happy to hear about feelings. Yes.
Yeah, this is really cool talk. This is sort of maybe mirroring some thoughts I've had for a while about like a lot of the interfaces that like non-firmness have to interact with are like kind of non-compositional and like don't have it feels to me like people have like very often have like rich computational interface like goes bullet, right? Like grab my location information and send it to like a group chat or something. But like unless your like messaging application gives you a function to do that, you like can't actually do it. And this idea of like thinking about interfaces fundamentally is acts of programming or like these like sort of maybe like GUI things as like acts of programming. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on like this malleability stuff that we call this sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great point. And I'm glad you're raising the term compositionality or composability because in my paper on this, there's some stuff that didn't make it to the presentation, which is sort of about that image of, even if you're just using a line at the shell to run a one-off command, that syntax, it presents a door into parameterization. It presents a door or into composition. So even if you're using it in a non-compositional way or a non-parameterized way, it's like one little step away from making it part of a larger programmatic process. And we don't have that property with something like a foreign GUI. I think the question of like how do we make things that have the richness and direct manipulation qualities of GUIs while also having the compositionality that we love from programming that's a really good way of framing like part of the challenge here. And I had a project called Ingraft that was trying to do that in the context of like interactive programming environments, but it's like a much bigger question than that. Yeah, so thank you. Yes, catch up.
Okay, I'll ask the horrible question everyone doesn't want me to ask, which is prompting programming. Specifically, no tool use, no rag, pure inference over the text.
Yeah, I mean, if you're making dynamic artifacts, then according to some definitions, it absolutely is. It's like, well, I can make my dynamic data visualization by, blah and blah and blah, or by prompting.
Well, I mean, when the artifact is just the output text.
What's that?
When the output's just the output text.
Well, I guess I don't know why that would be programming. But well, okay. But I think what I wanted to get to though is that there's if you're looking at it through ends, it absolutely is. If you're looking at it through means, well, the way that you talk to the AI, to what extent does that involve these kinds of like elements of abstraction, elements of like, are you like describing the process, or are you saying, hey, make me this thing and it does it in one shot, and that would feel less like programming. But I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. Yeah, those are just my off the cuff kind of. Yes.
You asked for feelings, so I felt that most of the things you showed as examples of business programming, my feeling was just yes. And my feeling was also like, who doesn't serve to exclude some of these things from programming, just as a practical reason.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. And this talk, you may notice, like, just entirely ignores the fact that programming it's like really deeply cultural and social construct, and this kind of game of like who gets to draw that boundary and why are they doing it is, I think about at least when I was growing up, there were always some annoying people in line who were like, just because you're writing HTML doesn't mean you're programming. Like that's not programming, or that kind of thing, and probably even more significant versions of that. So I think that merits a lot more conversation and depth, which I didn't do at all here. But I also like, for me as somebody trying to play with the edges of these categories, I do think that these words we use have really deep ideas embedded in them, and I like the project of trying to pull out what those are and do new things with them. So that's why I do care about definitions, even from a non-cultural point of view.
Thank you, Josh.